any sector. And therefore, we need to manage that transition carefully. But what normally, when we are polemical, we normally ignore is that we're also very clear in wanting to move to cleaner energy. That's why the biggest growth in the RP is given to renewables. It is a message that we want to move to cleaner energy. But we still remain convinced that other technologies have a big role to play. Coal is going to be significant for a long time. And nuclear will play a major role. Gas will play a major role. And all other energy sources are necessary for this economy to grow. It means that if we invest in infrastructure, we can share prosperity now, next, and beyond. And let me stop there so that we give space for the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Minister. Vivien, Chief Economist, Vivien Foster, Chief Economist for Infrastructure at World Bank. Vivien, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. I don't seem to be able to share my PowerPoint. I don't know if anyone on the other side is able to project it.
Hi, Vivien. I've just given you presenter privileges. Can you try again?
Okay, share my, okay. Ah, yeah, okay.
Oh, lovely.
Is that visible?
Yeah, that's perfect. If you just click on, there we go, perfect.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, and thank you so much to the government of South Africa for your kind invitation to participate in this important dialogue. I suppose that my role on the panel is to bring a wider international perspective to the conversation. And in particular, I was asked by the organizers to reflect on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the power sector around the world and how it may affect our plans and strategies going forward. So that's what I would like to do in the next few minutes. In particular, I'm going to talk about the impact of the crisis on the power sector, considering both the collapse in power demand and the resulting intensifying financial pressure on both state-owned enterprises and PPPs. And I'd also like to review the government policy response to the crisis in the power sector. So let's begin by just taking stock of the magnitude of the impact of the economic downturn on power utilities around the world. The World Bank, we've been trying to monitor the impacts that this crisis is having on the power sector. And we, as you can see, looking at different regions around the world, you see Sub-Saharan Africa there, the second in the list, that the reduction in power demand has been quite substantial. And it's reflected also very much the severity of the lockdown measures that have been put in place by the governments. But in the worst case, the reduction can be as much as 25% of electricity demand, which is very major. And I understand that in South Africa, it has been towards the upper end of this range. This is having severe financial consequences, both for state-owned enterprises and independent power projects. In the case of state-owned enterprises, many public utilities, particularly in the developing world, were already in financial distress prior to COVID-19. And they are now facing even more severe challenges. In addition to the aggregate reduction in power demand that I just illustrated, there's been a shift in power demand away from industrial towards residential consumption due to quarantine arrangements. In many countries where industrial customers cross-subsidize residential customers, that means that the decline in utility revenues can sometimes be even steeper than the decline in utility demand. At the same time, state-owned enterprises that would normally turn to the government for financial support in these kind of situations are facing a government situation which is characterized by tremendous fiscal pressures with all manner of social protection obligations, pressures to bail out companies across the economy to support employment and to cater to those who are most severely affected by the crisis. So this puts state-owned enterprises in a particularly difficult situation. At the same time, countries with major independent power project programs are also in a difficult situation. many countries, particularly in the rest of the African continent, have tended to provide substantial take-or-pay clauses or obligations in order to reduce the risk of private sector investment in the sector. As power declines, it may be increasingly difficult, and as utility finances deteriorate, it may be increasingly difficult for these payments to be honored. And we are already getting reports from different parts of the world of countries where the power sector is struggling to meet the financial obligations to IPPs. There's been significant scale back of payments in countries like Pakistan and Jordan, for example. Countries like Kenya and Ghana are also facing significant challenges, particularly where there may be overcapacity in power generation. In order to address this issue, we think it's very important at this time to and exploit whatever contractual flexibility may be available in IPP contracts. In many parts of the world, force majeure clauses are being invoked and efforts are being made to restructure both the finances and the operational targets of the IPPs to salvage as far as possible these contracts to make sure that they're able to withstand the crisis and into the recovery period. So this is a major area of focus. It's an area where we stand ready to support countries who are addressing these difficult challenges. In order to respond to these kinds of challenges, governments around the world have taken extraordinary policy measures targeted at the electricity sector. We can divide these measures into two categories: measures to relieve electricity customers and measures to relieve power utilities. You can see in the top half of the chart that the measures to relieve the customers are the most common. In the left-hand chart, we see that in many countries, there have been targeted subsidies to particularly disadvantaged households. Or in blue, they have offered the ability to defer payment of electricity bills, or in some cases, both of these measures have been implemented. While these measures are well motivated and understandable in the circumstances, they obviously raise another concern, which is that of an erosion of payment discipline for electricity bills, which would further threaten the financial stability of the sector. In some countries, there has, in addition, on the top right-hand side, been some cases of actual price reductions and price freezes that have been enacted during the crisis, although these are less common than the first category of measures. Finally, in the bottom part of the presentation, you can see that only in a few countries, in yellow there, have there been efforts to provide actual direct liquidity support to utilities at this point in time. But we suspect that there will be increasing pressure over time as the finances deteriorate. One of the key responses that governments are making to the COVID-19 crisis is to enact fiscal stimulus packages as a means of spurring economic recovery from the crisis. Just as a reminder of the last financial crisis that we faced was the global financial crisis of 2008-9, which in retrospect seems small in comparison to what we're facing today. But at that time, many countries implemented fiscal stimulus packages, including South Africa among them, which were of the order of, at least 4%, around 4% of GDP. In many of those countries, and again, South Africa was one of them, infrastructure featured heavily, as you can see there in green, in the fiscal stimulus package. And there's a lot of discussion about whether infrastructure should feature again as part of the economic recovery that countries are hoping to establish in the coming months. At the bank, we've been looking broadly at what has been the experience with fiscal stimulus packages, what are the lessons from experience. And one of the lessons is that the efficacy of fiscal stimulus really depends a lot on the macroeconomic circumstances of the country. In particular, the lower the levels of debt, the more accommodative the monetary regime, and in general, the more closed the economy, the more powerful will be the impact of a fiscal stimulus. So while I don't want to go into this complex topic, I simply want to flag that it matters, the macroeconomic environment matters when deciding how to do a fiscal stimulus. What I'd like to focus on rather is what kind of, how does a fiscal stimulus, can it be made more effective in terms of the infrastructure sectors themselves? And we've identified several factors. The first is the quality of the investments. If a good infrastructure project that's well prepared, well selected, carefully appraised, has the impact to really address, to bring about economic growth. And therefore, even if a country becomes indebted to build that project, the returns in terms of economic growth should still be such that the debt sustainability situation would improve. In other words, the project should add more to the economy than it adds to the debt. However, if countries build white elephants, the opposite happens. They add more to debt than they add to the economy. So it's particularly critical at this time to ensure that there is good governance around project appraisal processes to ensure that high impact projects are selected. The second important issue is the timeliness of the infrastructure. As we all know, large infrastructure projects, while they may be very important, are often very slow to implement. And therefore, they may not be very suitable for fiscal stimulus unless they're already at an advanced stage of preparation that can be accelerated. Otherwise, one looks typically for more shovel-ready projects. These can be more small-scale, simple public works interventions that are also then more widely distributed across the economy. The other issue I wanted to mention is the nature of infrastructure. When governments adopt fiscal stimulus packages, they usually have a particular policy objectives in mind. And sometimes those policy objectives are not necessarily mutually compatible. When we look at government's experiences with fiscal stimulus, we can discern 4 different types of objectives. There's short-run employment, long-run growth, green recovery, and social inclusion. Depending on which of these objectives is paramount, your selection of infrastructure would vary. So I'd like to just maybe highlight that some of the lessons from the global financial crisis stimulus. In Indonesia, we saw a particularly successful stimulus program because they managed to disperse 90% of the resources within a year and created an estimated 1 million jobs. In China, there was also a good fiscal program, but analysts have subsequently questioned whether all of the investments were as efficient as they could have been. Whereas in the US, the fiscal stimulus program suffered from very slow implementation. It was delayed by a year, so by the time it came in, it was too late to have a real effect on the crisis. So here are some of the lessons of the recent past. I'd now like to end by talking about the different types of stimulus objectives that governments might have and how the energy sector could feed into those. So first of all, if the government's preeminent objective is short-term job creation, then infrastructure differs greatly in the number of jobs it can create and how cost-effective those jobs are. So, for example, some of the renewable energy projects, which may be very important from a green recovery perspective, are relatively expensive per job created compared to, say, projects that target rural electrification or building energy efficiency retrofits. I think all of these aspects are relevant to South Africa. If we turn to the second objective, which is infrastructure to support long-term growth, here, if the government's preeminent objective is to really, stimulate innovation, productivity gains, and long-term growth, then the kind of infrastructure you might choose would be more the high-tech type of infrastructure. We are, as you know, in the midst of this 4th industrial revolution with a huge number of waves of innovation taking place across the economy. I just wanted to highlight here China's 2020 fiscal stimulus program recently announced, which is going to focus on new infrastructure, meaning 5G digital networks, ultra-high voltage transmission lines, intercity high-speed railways, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, as well as data infrastructure. So if that is the objective, then again, it's a different type of energy infrastructure that needs to be prioritized. And finally, I'd like to talk about the green recovery. There's been a lot of talk about the green recovery. As we know, in the short run, the COVID-19 crisis has actually reduced carbon emissions and local air pollution due to the economic downturn. But many fear that as the economy rebounds, we may experience something that people are describing as revenge pollution, meaning that in the haste to stimulate the economic recovery, commitment to environmental goals may be weakened. And we may shift towards dirtier technologies, particularly given the low oil price that we're currently experiencing, as well as the higher costs of capital and the more limited availability of capital, all of which could militate against the choice of cleaner technologies. So if the government's predominant objective is to stimulate a green recovery, then there are many things that can be done in the energy sector to support that. And I'd like to distinguish between investments, choices of investments in the dark green hexagons, and supportive policy reforms in the light green hexagons. So in particular, the types of investments that might support a green recovery could be the renewable energy plants, the storage infrastructure that needs to go with them, as well as the transmission investments that are needed in order to make renewable energy accessible to the grid. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure is something that could be considered in that space, as well as digitalization and modernization of power utility infrastructure, the so-called smart grid, as well as energy efficiency investments across public, private, and social sectors. And we know that in South Africa, for example, that energy intensity remains relatively high. So this could be an area of potential interest. Finally, I want to emphasize that given the limited availability of fiscal space, choosing green investments is important, but equally important is adopting the policy reforms that will help to keep the economy on a cleaner trajectory. This includes in particular a reform of energy pricing, whether it's reforming utility tariff structures to provide clearer price signals for adoption of new technologies, or indeed moving towards closer cost recovery while providing a well-targeted safety net to ensure that energy remains affordable to the poor. So I'd like to leave it there and simply to reiterate the comments of our Vice President, Makhtar Diop, who spoke in the opening session. We at the World Bank stand ready to prioritize our support to South Africa during this challenging time. Thank you.
Vivien, thank you very much. Before we move on, I'd just like to tell the participants who have joined us that there is an opportunity to interact with our panelists. If you look at the chat box, you can send a message through. Emil Unga, I've already got yours, for example, and quite simply, the sooner you get your messages in, the better the chance we get through them. Obviously, you will want to react to the various panelists, but that option is open for you. Emil's got in rather speedily. Let's move on swiftly now from UCT, from the Energy Research Center, Jessie Burton. Jessie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to join such an esteemed panel, so thank you for having me. And also, it's an honor to discuss what I think is South Africa's most important sector and understanding how we can address our economic recovery, but also the underlying structural barriers to a more inclusive economy for South Africa are very important. And I see the energy sector as core to this. I mean, I can't do anything except agree with everything that Vivien said, but then speak a little bit about the South African context. I think we shouldn't forget that even before COVID hit us and put us in this hole, that we were already in a crisis. We're the most unequal society in the world. We have extreme levels of poverty. 55% of people live in poverty in South Africa. 25% of people don't have enough food. We had structural limits to growth that need to be addressed. And what's the role of the energy sector in catalyzing this new pathway? I think there are two kind of key areas that we should maybe think about and discuss today. That are part of a sustainable recovery. So one, I think the energy sector's got a core role to play in a green RDP. I think we should think again about how we build social infrastructure and social inclusion with better service delivery to address a lack of water, a lack of sanitation, limits to energy access, although we have very good electrification rates, they're not keeping up. And besides that, poor households typically can't afford the electricity even if they have a connection. The second part of that is we need an urgent stimulus for the productive sectors of the economy. Now, there are two main drivers of fragility in South Africa as I see it. One, the electricity supply crisis that we face. So, Minister, thank you for bringing up energy security. I think that's going to occupy us a lot of the time today. Eskom's financial crisis is now putting us completely at risk. We need a solution that's more than just IPPs and more than just Eskom. We're going to have to think about reimagining the whole sector to deal with some of these crises. The second kind of driver of fragility is, I think, a lack of diversification into labor-intensive sectors and more sustainable sectors that don't rely on 20th century for our balance of trade. And what are our options? So my team at UCT, what we mostly work on is trying to understand the welfare and economic outcomes of energy choices. So we do long-term energy planning, very similar to the integrated resource plan, but for the full energy sector, and also looking at the economic, it's linked to an economy-wide model. So we can understand what are the employment effects of different decisions, what are the GDP effects of different decisions. Our work has shown very much like the work of the DMRE and the IRP, the work of the CSIR and other analysts in the country, that it's very clear that what we need to do now is implement. We need to implement the IRP. Our electricity future is one that's made up primarily of new wind, new solar, gas, batteries, and other kinds of storage like pump storage to provide flexible capacity. The advantage of this build plan, as I see it, is that we need to get it going, but it has some advantages. We get cheaper electricity than if we build expensive mega projects. We meet our climate change goals. It creates more jobs over time. Lifting constraints on the IRP, for example, if we don't lift those constraints by 2050, electricity is much more expensive than if you build higher. And we can have energy security. We need to build things that are very, very fast, that can be on the grid quickly, and that are low risk. So as demand changes over time, because we don't know what will unfold in this post-COVID world, we can pull back or accelerate our build plan. This is backed by the DMRE's work in the IRP and the IEP, the CSIR, UCT, TIPS, Meridian Economics, and Eskom zone analysis. Getting ourselves out of load shedding is going to be incredibly important, because as soon as the economy starts growing again, we're going to hit that constraint. And it helps us meet the national development goals of low carbon, climate resilient, and inclusive economies. And that inclusive part is important. I think we should be thinking about multiple configurations. I think community ownership, municipalities procuring their own power, households feeding back into the grid, especially poor households who can earn an income from that. I think that would be really rethinking our transition for justice, to make it a just transition. Secondly, a green RDP. Supply is only one part of the equation, and we always focus on supply in South Africa. We have for 100 years, but we should be thinking about what is energy for. It's for people. So let's work on making housing energy efficiency. Vivien's numbers were great at showing how it's a very least cost but high employment way of getting people into work. It reduces their energy bills, it gives them better living conditions. We can do that in buildings, improving workplaces. We should be working on making sure that appliances are energy efficient, getting people off paraffin, coal and dung and onto electricity. We can create jobs doing these kinds of retrofits and expand the distribution infrastructure. At the same time, we should be thinking more than just energy, but what does energy feed? It also feeds the transport sector, for example. We need a transport sector that's energy efficient and also inclusive. So we should be looking at buses, making our rail systems work, getting our building smart charging infrastructure for electrification and non-motorized transport. And for me, this is really what a just transition is about for South Africa. So we need to protect coal workers and communities as this transition happens. We need to make sure that there's retraining and there's new economic opportunities in coal-dependent regions. But we also need to make sure that we're making a labor-intensive economy that works for the and not just the few. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jessie. A lot of food for thought. Let's move on to our next panelist. And the he's like a racehorse, one who can get up the starting stalls. At yesterday's conversations, anything to go by. The Executive Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Phakwe Group, we welcome Thabiso Tenyane.
Thank you very much, David, and to the Minister for having opened up this. But having listened to the symposium today and all the opening by the President, I'm going to be very direct in saying my concern is we are like a country that's about to take off, but there is not enough fuel for that jet to take us off. And there is no well-experienced that are there ready to take us to the destination of choice, because I had expected that the President would have told us that what is the policy direction that we are taking, facing the situation that we are facing currently. Therefore, then, as my other panelists and colleagues, you have already mentioned, I want to start by saying, in order for us to have a constructive discussion, we need to be open and honest about where we are and acknowledge the reality that we are facing up with. In regard to, if we speak about energy, energy is the blood in the veins of the economy, the same as water it is to the human body. Therefore, then, if you look at energy only from an electricity perspective, it's a myopic and a shortest, not a right way of looking at it. When we talk about energy in this context, we need to take into consideration the IRP, which defines the roadmap for the electricity. But in it, we need to take the gas master plan. We must be clear around how do you want to utilize gas as a game changer in the country. But to that, we then also have liquid fuels master plan. Those three create what we call an integrated energy plan, which I'm happy today that the minister that is looking after that is today in our presence. But where I want us to be honest, it is in regarding the electricity infrastructure. In particular, we always say that Eskom is too big to fail. My point is that rhetoric is unfounded. Eskom has failed and it has failed our country. If we are in agreement with that, we can then therefore then determine what solutions are going to be the alternative in us moving forward. Because it is clear that Eskom says I have 50,000 megawatt capacity, but the energy availability factor of Eskom as we speak today in its recent report seem to be saying I am sitting at below 70% energy availability. Now, if we do not appreciate that we do not have energy which drives any economy, the wheels of this economy won't turn if we don't have energy. And that is something that I think we need to be able to look at and accept that we have one of our monopoly utility, which is still vertically structured and it has failed. So in order to move forward and stimulate this economy, where should we start? Because it's like someone is saying to us, your car is broken. And you are saying, listen, I'll keep on driving and trying to fix whatever that is in the engine broken. Instead of saying, can we find an alternative car and take this one to be fixed? Eskom is 97 years old. You may want to take it into the most specialist for it to be operated or retrofitted. The reality of it is, as it comes out of there, it will still walk slow because it's old. So now we are very happy that we have a minister that came and concluded in bringing in the IRP last year. But that IRP is not the be and the all. It's just one component of energy, because if we do not look at the entire plans, the NDP said we should pronounce as a country that in 2018, we need to be clear as to whether we're building a mega refinery or not. One of the biggest consumption in a recovery is electricity. So if you issue the plan of the electricity, while you have not concluded about the size of the refinery that we are bringing, there is going to be some shortfall. In the record of the decision for NERSA that has came out on our minister having then made a determination on the risk mitigating program, Eskom's views was we need 4,000. The determination is saying 2,000. That in itself, there is lack of coherence upon the appreciation of what is it that is sitting in front of us. However, it does not mediate the fact that the IRP will probably close that particular gap. But I want to appeal to the minister in saying the same agency we put in changing the regulations in like 3 to 2 days on the COVID situation which we're facing up with, can we take the same in the electricity crisis that we are facing up with? Because it will tend to move us much more better. Because if we're not looking at energy from an integrated perspective, we are seeing a lot of our refineries being converted to import-export terminals, which job losses. Load shedding also. The cost of unserved electricity ranges between 2 to 3 billion a day, which that by itself creates deindustrialization and increases job losses on top of the 29% unemployment that we are sitting with. When we have post-COVID, we'll be sitting above 40% because the type of job losses that we then had on the impact of the lockdown is increasingly so. Eskom has already pronounced that during COVID, Minister, we are already having load shedding. So it is clear that when we open the economy, it's gonna then be worse than what it is. So therefore then, if gas is gonna be the alternative, you should already, and we are very happy, Minister, because we do know that you engage your counterparts in Mozambique in order to say 1 + 1 must be 5 and not 2, because you want to then look at this Eskom situation in saying, how do I address the current load shedding gap? But also if we want to talk about the just transition is unique in every country. The appreciation that we need to have is the fact that in Witbank now, when they are decommissioning those power stations, what is going to be the alternative? If you say it's going to be gas, there's going to be less jobs that are going to be absorbed in maintaining a gas plant because you just need the gas to push it through to those turbines to do. It must be a combination of biomass and gas. Therefore, then the government should be the one going either to the mines, or the government should be the one identifying the land to start planting that biomass and then making it available as a feedstock and creating factories that will create pallets of this biomass to be burned so that we can absorb as much of the employees which were in the mining companies. Because when you decommission, it's 2 reasons. It's either the plant has reached its age or the coal underneath is being depleted. If you fetch the coal from another mine, which is a distance, the cost of coal is going to be higher. And hence, the situation that Eskom finds itself saying, I have the biggest input cost to my cost is coal, but the cost is becoming higher. The justification of the mining companies is a grade C coal, which used to burn before, is done. The coal, they're also exporting it and we're going to sell it with the same price. Therefore then, if we had projected that, we could be, but we are happy to have also a minister that is both having the experience of mining. He's being a miner himself, he's being underground. Therefore, then he will deal with this just transition in a manner that is much more balanced. If we don't approach things from a common understanding, Minister, I think that we're going to have a challenge. If one solution is gas, let me show the incoherency that exists in government now. Transnet is saying, I'm busy with gas I'm going to be also busy with Kucha. Eskom is saying, I'm going to repurpose my power stations with gas. Who's going to be this gas? Because we know that South Africa needs to import it because we are not necessarily exploring our own gas here. Because the only company which was doing exploration of gas offshore was Petro SA, which in itself, in its current form, is having its own troubles that the minister is trying to deal with. So that incoherence in the approach, we should be by now saying, this is an area which we have identified as an IDZ, that all gas industries, we have an IDZ as Kucha, we have an IDZ in Richards Bay, we have an IDZ in other areas. We are going to be dedicating that when the areas grow, they must grow all at data. Or else a smaller person that is looking for gas is never going to be able to afford to import it. So my appeal is, as we engaging in these things, the world has shown us that Norway at a particular point was a country that we didn't know. But today, Norway has the biggest sovereign fund, which the funds thereof came from gas. That's how far I'll leave it, David.
Thank you so much, Thabiso. Minister, I know that you've got a fair amount that you'd probably want to say in reaction to Thabiso's comments. I'm going to put a buffer between you and Thabiso just for the moment, because we've got our last panelist, but not least, as they always say, the head of the Independent Power Producers Office, Tshifiwa Magoro. Tshifiwa, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Minister. David, sorry, I'm having a problem with my webcam. I hope it's okay. I can continue with just the audio with no visuals.
We want to see you. We don't know you, Tshifiwa.
Now we'll arrange another session, so I'm not too sure what went wrong here, but I will continue in any case. Good afternoon, Minister, and good afternoon to all the listeners. Yes, we're coming from the IPP office. We want to provide some of the solutions here. We've had all the challenges, and the energy challenges in the country are real. And being an energy intensive economy, we know the constraints that we had. And I think everyone has spoken about the challenges that we had even before COVID-19. And in a way, I think COVID-19 helped us to go through this winter, with a bit of energy, with no load shedding. And we know that post COVID-19, we'll probably be back to where we were before the pandemic. So, but my point here, I'm just going to focus on the IPP office as a unit. The office has been created back in 2010, by the Department of Energy to facilitate procurement of energy from independent power producers. So I am going to focus on this aspect as a possible solution to some of the challenges that we have in the energy space. I know the challenges are multitude, but this is the one aspect where we can harness on as a country and solve some of these challenges. So some of the highlight from the office, we have managed to sign up about 112 projects from IPPs with a total contribution of 6,400 megawatts. 4,400 of that is already in commercial operation. To date, we have generated about 47 terawatt hours into the grid, which helps us to mitigate about 47 megatons of CO2 emissions. We have created 50,000 job years throughout the country. Total investment, 209 billion in the industry, 42 of which was foreign direct investment. We have managed to create about 33% Black ownership in this space of the IPPs, and 9% of which was through the community trusts. And of late, following the bid window 4, we have had all 9 provinces now with footprints, at least one project from the IPPs as far as renewable is concerned. Social economic development spending of about 400 million, that is to support the local communities. There is still a lot of work to be done in this space, and we all know that, and which is why the next 10 years has to be different. I must also say the office not only look at the renewables, they also facilitate procurement of other technologies as well. We also had the coal program, which unfortunately there are still legal challenges relating to environmental approvals. But we work basically as mandated by the department in terms of our procurement. As I mentioned, there are challenges which I think are worth highlighting, especially in the economic development space. As much as we have made a lot of progress in the procurement of IPP power, the area of Black ownership, local community participation, that needs a lot more focus going forward. The same with local content, localization, industrialization. We have not made enough. And these are some of the areas where I believe we should focus on as we continue implementing the IRP going into the future. We are also doing a number of projects within the department to try and unlock some of the Black equity from the earlier projects to see how we can facilitate more investment by Black industrialists into the future projects. Then maybe I can also touch on the current programs. The first one, I think Mr. Tenyane touched on, the 2,000 megawatts risk mitigation. What we're doing there, we are now preparing the RFP, which should be out in the market within the next month. And that will be for the 2,000 megawatts. And for the first time, this time around, we are not going for a specific technology. We have left it as a technology agnostic program where the bidders will provide the solution to the problems that have been indicated by the system operator within Eskom. And that is the 2,000 megawatts gap, which is from 5 a.m. in the morning until about 2100, with some other technical requirements regarding the performance of the plant as well. We're looking at about 10 to 15 or 20 years term for this program, but all the details will come out of the RFP, as I said, which will be out within probably by the end of July. This document should be out in the market. So it will be fuel and non-fuel based technologies, accommodating all of them, depending on whether these technologies are able to solve the problems that have been highlighted by Eskom. And then in addition, we also looking at the determination that the minister issued in February regarding the RFP, which we will be working on within the next 12 months or so. That is in relation to the second determination tied up to the IRP 2019. In there, we're looking at about 1,500 of clean coal, 6,000 plus megawatts of wind, another 3,000 from PV, and 3,000 from gas. And for the first time, we're also looking at 500 megawatts of storage as well. So that determination is out, and NERSA is busy now doing the consultation regarding the concurrence that they have to issue before we can proceed with the process. And as I said, that we're looking at the second quarter of next year that we will be going out to the market for that determination. And again, I must highlight the critical aspects here is to support the countries as we recover from this global pandemic, so that we can get everyone, including the local communities, to participate in this program, especially in the energy space where we are building these facilities within their geographical locations. So just to summarize, as the IPP office, we have built a reputation and we have established ourselves as a benchmark organization in the last 10 years. And we are looking forward to maintain that credibility and support the government through the economic recovery process going forward. And so, David, I will stop here and then allow the audience and the panel to continue with the conversation. Thank you.
Tshifiwa, thank you very much. And you may have answered Neil's question about the IPP project emergency RFI. Will it go ahead? You have been talking about deadlines in July and the next quarter. Neil, if that doesn't answer the question, just send me a follow-up on chat. I noticed as well, there's also Q&A for our participants if you want to send a question on Q&A, and I've already got at least one question there. So we starting to get questions in. So those now, all our panelists who've had an opportunity to talk, I'm going to go round again now and start with you, Minister. So back where we started, because there was a fair amount that Thabiso Tenyane was saying that you may well want to reply to. My question, though, is, and it might be 24 hours too early to pose this question, because we've got the finance minister giving that emergency budget tomorrow, which might inform us on a better way of how COVID-19 is affecting us. But my question is going to be about IRP 2019 and to what extent it needs to be revisited, if at all, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you could deal with that, tell us about IRP 2019. Are we still on track? And also, if you need to respond to Thabiso Tenyane's comments, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, David. The lowest voice in the panel is your voice, David. I don't know why. Let me start off by putting in perspective cost of electricity. Cost of electricity must be looked into in various aspects. First of all, the cost to the economy. That is the first one. Half the time we never have that discussion, we talk units. Number two is cost per unit, which is very important cumulatively to the cost to the economy. And I think the debate that we're having, that I describe as polemical, is always about this cost per unit, where others say will be cheap next year, but we're expensive now. You know, I don't know, David, if you know that we are paying 425 cents per unit in PV in window 1 and 294 in window 2, 174 in window 3, but we sell all that in 89 to 1 rand. So that is cost per unit. In the future, it will be cheap, but with this cost is what we carry today. Now, let me go to the question of what Mr. Tenyane talked about. No, we're not only looking into electricity. IRP talks about electricity, but we look in all forms of energy sources. Let me give you an example. In electricity, IRP is solid. We're working on gas, and actually, we see gas as a game changer in the transition, and including LPGs as taking a lot of pressure from Eskom. And therefore, I agree with you when you say Eskom has 50 megawatts connected, but at best it is having 31 available, which is actually a misnomer. There is no 50 megawatts. Yes?
Yes.
It's 50 megawatts connected, it's 31 available all the time. Yes. If it is at this price, it's 33 megawatts. So,
Yes.
yeah, so when you have that, there is a problem already. That's why a proposal that we put on the table that we're working on is the question of opening up competition at the level of generation, so that we don't depend only on Eskom for generation of electricity. There must be diversity of generators, but that will require us to redefine the role of transmission. The ISMO bill was dealing with that. We're taking that bill back to Parliament so that a transmission is the market. Then you open continuous generation, a transmission is the market, and the problem is we're beginning to see weaknesses in the distribution as well. So we'll have to do the analysis of the whole value chain. That is where we are. So I agree with you there. And therefore, the vertical integration is something that we're already talking about, unbundling of Eskom, and more specifically, the redefinition of the role of transmission in that value chain. You can look at the Dutch model, to a great extent, you can look at the Chinese model. That's the route that we think is sustainable in this day and age. The issue of whether we were looking at 2,000, Eskom talk about 5,000. No, we talk about 2,000 to 3,000 megawatt emergency. That is what was projected by Eskom. That keeps on moving. But there are other interventions that will actually deal with the gap that is emerging. The first one is own generation for own use. For example, I can tell you that on the permitted one, which are registered, 1 megawatt or less, with 130 permits issued already, where they have been registered. And they generate a total of 59 megawatts. On other bigger than 1 megawatt, we have issued 5, we're working on 2, already 59 megawatts are licensed. So we're beginning to open up the own generation. It is going to close that gap. Number 3, gas is going to be a major factor. We're in peace discussion with Mozambique. It's our neighbor, they have a lot of gas. We're also exploring. Total has found gas in Bulpata, and we're expecting the 2 blocks of Petro SA to give us gas. So there's a lot of exploration happening. Shale gas in the Karoo promises to give us additional gas. So we're not only looking at electricity as if it is the be and all. What is it?
The be all and end all.
Yeah, so we look into the whole range. Now, let's go to the question of the confusion that you are having. Because transfer talk, Richards Bay, we took off and so forth. We had that discussion this morning, ironically. And our conclusion was that actually, in South Africa, we may need at least 3 LNG complexes to import gas, 1 in Richards Bay, 1 in Kucha, 1 in Saltana, because as gas begin to play a major role, there's going to be massive importation of gas to the energy. So let me conclude by saying energy, I agree, is the catalyst for economic growth. That's why we must be open-minded. Let me give you an example. Renewable energy people have been putting pressure on us, giving them window 5. If you ask me, from the department, we have opened it. There are 2 areas that must be opened up. 1, Eskom as the buyer. 2, the regulator agreeing to that. From the department, as far as we're concerned, window 5 is open with more than just over 6,000 megawatts for renewables. So people must begin to prepare, because once those 2 bottlenecks are open, we'll open them. They must not say we're taking them by surprise. They must start preparing. And I want to stop at that. No, let me make one last point. The last point is, during the lockdown, we had what I described to everybody, that listen, this false satisfaction, the question of no load shedding and so forth. We said it is not a question of improved efficiency, it's the decline in demand. So that is not something you celebrate. That's why we didn't close any refinery in energy. We opened all of them, but ultimately 4 were closed because the demand at the end of the pipe was almost non-existent. So demand is quite important as you talk to the supply side of energy. Let me leave it at that. If need be, I will come back.
Minister, thanks so much. I hope my microphone volume is a bit better now, and you can hear me.
It's better now.
David, can I come in?
Yep, please do. Go for it, Thabiso.
Minister, highly appreciated in your response. And I'm highlighting this from more a broader perspective. But let me bring to your attention where we're sitting, and government is government is government. The sixth administration, we still look at it as government. 2013, there was an amendment bill introduced.
Government is government. Government is government.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So in 2013, there was an amendment of, there was a bill that was introduced for the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act. 2014, it went to the National Assembly. 2015, it went to the National Conference of Provinces. The president didn't want to sign it, returned it to the Assembly in 2015. 2016, it was in the Assembly. 2018, it was in the national provinces again. The new minister came in, that bill was dropped and abandoned in 2019. On the 24th of December, everyone celebrated in the industry when you were gazetting another new bill of the upstream petroleum. In May the 7th, then the minister issues another statement that is not aligned to the bill that we all were celebrating and excited that now is becoming clearer. Because, Minister, we've been waiting for 7 years, and I speak as an industry that I'm also into gas. Therefore, then it is concerning that it took 7 years, the bill was abandoned. There is GAMP, which we worked on, we abandoned it. There is liquid fuel master plan, which we never concluded it. So really, what we are saying as the industry to you, Minister, is there is a lot of investment we put on the basis of policy certainty. The policy uncertainty makes our plans to be very difficult. And this is just the appeal. It's not to say that you are not looking at issues in the broader context. And I appreciate that response. However, I'm saying, Minister, we wish like we could continue to engage on a continuous basis. It must not be the symposium that brings us closer to you as industries that we have emerged in South Africa.
Emily,
Thank you, David.
you have been running away. You have been running away. We've been calling you.
David, can I jump in here? You're
Yeah.
on mute. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. This is really interesting, and I just want to make a comment as an a person who works with energy planners. It's very, very complicated and difficult to do integrated energy planning, but I think South Africa needs an IEP. We need to be thinking about the intersection and the integration of all these different sectors. Doing a GUMP on its own or this on its own, you lose a lot of the subtlety and the trade-offs and the important questions of what happens in different sectors, but also what are the advantages of doing something through electricity versus gas, or gas versus electricity, or gas versus coal for heating and industry. And all of those things need to be assessed. What I think in this context, in this conversation about gas, we need to think about two things though. One, what are the global trends around this, especially in terms of getting finance? So for coal, it's very, very difficult to get finance for any longer, unless it's from a Chinese bank usually, because many asset managers, insurers, and other kinds of financiers have exclusions. It's sometimes just for coal, it's often for coal and gas. So in the context of us thinking about a big gas expansion plan, how is that gonna work? The other question really around this is, I think South Africa probably does need gas. Most of the electricity modeling, at least, and in our case at UCT, we do full sector modeling, there is a need for it in the coming years as coal phases out, and in particular because we need flexible capacity to complement the renewables that we'll be building out in the next 30 years. So I don't disagree with that. But we need to then be thinking about a few things. We're not taking coal plants and replacing them with gas plants to run as baseload. Most of the analyses, we see gas coming in at between 8 and 15% in the power sector. In other sectors, is the best thing to do to switch from coal to gas, or is the best thing to do to keep those boilers running on coal and switch straight to hydrogen in the 2030s when it becomes viable? All of these are important questions that we need to address, and they make kind of important, and they're kind of investment decisions around how big your LNG storage looks, how does it work, how do we design the contracts for those power plants, and we shouldn't forget that in the rush to kind of get excited about infrastructure. We don't want to end up with stranded assets in another area again.
Thanks very much, Jesse. Vivien, do you want to come in on any of the points that have been raised?
Thanks, David. It's an interesting conversation. And while I'm not familiar with the details of the South African situation, maybe I can just make a few comments. I do think, there's obviously a lot of concerns around planning, which is really fundamental. And everything I've heard suggests that this integrated resource plan that you have is really a major step forward. I think with any energy planning, it's important to keep it up as things evolve, but also it's important to really, commit to the implementation of the plan. I mean, I've seen many countries adopt plans that were very well grounded to follow through on the implementation. So I think that's equally important. I do also want to mention that on the issue of employment, that I can see, given how crucial the issue of unemployment is in the South African context, that having a holistic view of the energy sector that takes into account the employment patterns of different types of energy and how that will evolve over time is really important. And in that sense, I'm very encouraged to hear that the UCT is doing this kind of work, and that dimension can be brought into the energy planning conversation. I also want to come back to the topic of energy efficiency, because I think all too often energy planners focus exclusively on the supply side of energy security, which is obviously fundamental. But actually what we're really looking for is supply-demand balance, and being able to manage demand effectively and to make energy more productive for the economy, to get more economic output from every unit of energy is really, really important. And that's where I think energy efficiency comes in. I mean, I was looking at the numbers, and globally, I think countries are getting about 20 cents of output per megajoule, but in South Africa, it's almost half that amount. So there's really, South Africa, what I'm trying to say is South Africa is a long way behind the energy efficiency frontier. The economy is becoming less energy efficient over time, less energy productive, if you like. And so I think that it would be important to include energy efficiency as part of the plan, and as an area that can also create employment, as we mentioned before. I think, in any energy plan, diversification is important, but also complementarity between different types of energies. And I think that's where the issue of gas being a more flexible resource than some of the more traditional fossil fuels is relevant in a country that has, really world-class renewable energy resources at its disposal. I think the other thing I wanted to point out is just, how successful South Africa's IPP program has been. It really stands out on the global stage as one of the most successful and best designed programs. It's exciting to hear that you have potentially another 15 gigawatts in the pipeline there, and that you're maybe moving towards a more technology neutral approach. I've seen that happen also in other countries as the renewables have matured and become more cost effective. So I think you have something that's you can really build on there. I think that when in countries that have large established incumbent utilities, such as you have in South Africa, I think a successful IPP program can be a way of rebalancing, the sort of the market power, if you like, because over time, if the new energy is coming primarily from IPPs, over time the position of the incumbent will naturally reduce, and there'll be more competition and less kind of market dominance, which is usually quite helpful in terms of improving performance and creating pressures to improve performance. So those are just a few observations. I do think that finally the issue of inclusion, we haven't talked very much about inclusion, but Jesse mentioned it earlier. And my understanding is that South Africa had an incredibly successful electrification program in the early 21st century, but the progress has started to plateau. I think you're still at around 91%. So I think, efforts to improve rural electrification, perhaps using decentralized technologies and taking advantage of, again, of the solar resource could be another important area of focus. Thank you.
Vivien, thank you for that. I've got some questions through on Q&A and on chat. I'm going to go through those in a few minutes. So to our participants who are watching this debate, get them in and we'll start going through them. Minister, if I could just throw one question at you. You may not have got my first one, but because of the low volume. But in your opening comments, you spoke about the important role of nuclear and gas. Jesse's been talking about the issue of gas as well. If I could just ask about nuclear, in the National Development Plan, it does flag the warning of the expense of nuclear. And given the economic devastation that's been wrought by COVID-19, how significantly does nuclear loom on your radar now as we count the cost of shutdown? Minister, you there?
Yes, I'm there.
We got you.
The first thing we must appreciate is that we have Quebec in our energy mix. It's the most efficient and most reliable and most cost effective. Actually, the lowest cost energy to Eskom is from Quebec. Despite all the things that people say in engaging, that it is too expensive and all that, it gives us energy at 40 cents a unit. Now, the first part of the project is to extend the life of Quebec by 20 years, from 2024 to 2044. That program is on the way, and it is going to happen. Team has been put together. It is going there to deal with that issue. Number two, if you read the IRP, we are actually counterposing our proposal to the 2010 IRP proposal of 9,600 megawatts. We say no, we will purchase nuclear at a pace, price, and a rate that the country can afford. That's what we're saying. And that's why we talk of modular power stations of nuclear. It is quite big in our picture that we should have, because we don't just need nuclear to for lighting. We are also leading in terms of producing isotopes at South Africa. So nuclear technology broadly is a technology that we need both for energy and for medical research. So it is big in our picture, but we have counterposed it with hydro in the IRP, which is quite difficult because it's out of the country, it's very far, it's difficult to influence. So we are having our eyes on nuclear. That's why we are putting out the request for information there, because we want to test the market. Are there any people who are interested? For example, in this day and age, if you can't afford the technology, you can give an operator a right to build, operate, and transfer. And in that way, you don't give cash, but you can still acquire that technology.
Yeah. The pebble bed modular reactor work was done quite significantly, 10, 15 years ago. Is that worth revisiting?
NEXA is looking at it very seriously. We have a new team at NEXA, quite serious team. They're looking at it, they're talking to Eskom.
On the issue of gas then, before I move to our questions, Jesse was talking about the issue of gas. We've got that enormous find, the Brulpadda find. We've got that massive gas field that has been identified off the coast of northern Mozambique, maybe too far away in terms of piping the gas down. How open is government to investing in infrastructure to capitalize on those gas finds? I realize Brulpadda is still some way off from becoming commercially viable.
South African government, through iGas, is 25% owner of the pipeline for Sasol, from the Mozambique gas field to Sasol. we're 25% owner. And with the current discussion, we're hoping to increase our shareholding in that, because we think that our neighbor Mozambique has big deposits of gas. We should access those gas. We must be friendly to Mozambique. Mozambique must be friendly to us. And that is therefore possible to have access to that gas, but want to continue with our drill. Actually, Total is coming back to drill additional wells in Bulpata, and we have 2 blocks of Petro SA around it, which we think that we must find a partner to drill them.
Let's go round to our panelists. Does anybody want to add something to what's been said?
Can I come in, David?
Yes, please do. Is that Thabiso? Yeah, Tshifiwa.
Yeah.
Or Thabiso? Who's it? Thabiso. Yes.
Thabiso.
Thabiso, go for it, Thabiso.
Yeah. I think I need to support the minister in regard to the perception that the country is having about nuclear. But I'm also challenging the minister to reconsider the position of the hydro, which we signed the treaty in 2013 in DRC, because when we talk least cost, that's 3 cents a dollar per kilowatt hour, that particular Inga project. However, I want to emphasize on the basis that it is clear that when Quebec was built, we can all reflect on the fact that did the country afford it then? It was not about that. If we are challenging and having shortage of electricity, and I say for an example, I want to demonstrate an example here. Let's say UK was having a problem of electricity. And from that particular context, can it go to Rome in Italy and say, please supply me with electricity? People will be tempted to say, no, it's too far. But the reality of the matter is the distance from Witbank to Cape Town is the distance that it was considered that distance from Witbank to Cape Town is the same distance as UK and Rome. So nuclear was looked at that the transmission lines that are going to go down to Cape Town will lose a significant percentage of electricity. But at the same time, nuclear requires rich uranium and seawater to cool off. And those 2 things in South Africa were having it in abundance, because rich uranium is the byproduct of mining gold. So therefore, then we need to use the abundance of the things that given us. And therefore, then when we say energy mix, is going to be all technologies without one favoring the other. The challenge with the renewable in replacing to the base load is wind is erratic, solar is 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock. But what are you going to do when you're dealing with the peak and the base load of factories that then are going to want to work on a 24-hour basis? So nuclear comes in very handy in supporting renewable, and I see that being going hand in hand.
Thanks, Thabiso. Jesse, you've got your hand up.
Oh, sorry, I think that was from earlier. You can ignore it.
Okay, no problem. Minister, do you want to respond to what Thabiso was saying?
Nuclear, he is actually thinking that our position is correct. I won't get into that. Let me go to hydro. He said, DRC, let's reconsider that. Countries are not only relating to one another on the basis of money. There is also diplomatic relations that we have, and the intracontinental trade in Africa is still very, very low. The Chinese and the Spanish are very hands-on the hydro project, and they're actually investing in it. African countries cannot afford it. We want to remain in that mix and be able to build a transmission line that can connect to us. In that way, it's not only about money, it's also about interconnectedness of the region in terms of electricity. there is already interconnectedness in Southern Africa in terms of the Southern African power pool. And therefore, it will add to that, and it's a safe option in the long term.
Let's go to some of the questions that are coming through. The first one I'm going to take is from Ntumba, who says several mentions have been made to Eskom being in financial difficulty on account of, amongst others, electricity tariffs that are not cost reflective. This position seems to be widely acknowledged. The question then is, what is the government doing to increase tariffs towards cost reflectively in order to enhance Eskom and by extension the power sector's financial viability? Would any of the panelists like to tackle that one?
David,
yes.
Look, let's not be deterred of this unfortunate situation that Eskom finds itself. There is policy element into it, but I don't think we have enough time to be looking at it. When the ANC government came into power in 1994, their actual focus was electrification of the broader masses of the country, in particular black. And therefore then Eskom couldn't be transformed at the time, mainly because its major goal was to then electrify as quicker as possible. But in a situation, I think we should also remember the apology that the President Thabo Mbeki offered on the context of having delayed because they were bundling power stations at the time, because the state was not having money in the same situation which we are finding ourselves. They were now clustering power stations. And at the time when they were doing that, you may sometimes taken an opportunity to go to the white paper of 1998, which prescribes clearly what was the intention of government at the time. But mining then challenged them because licenses were already issued. Mining said you can't delay on the basis of wanting to cluster the power stations and give them a bit to the private sector to inject the capital on a build, operate, and transfer. But at the same time, the alliance group was not in agreement because privatization was an issue at the time. Therefore, then there was that notion that if you privatize at the time, then the majority of won't find the electrification. But over and above that, there will be job losses. Because the ISMO bill was packed, as the minister has reflected on, because it was a question of, if we then take out transmission for the whaling tariff now, when we need to invest as much, is it right or wrong? Because the Midupian Kosile, the decision was made at that particular point. So the steepness of the Eskom still, if you compare it to other utilities, the only thing is the steepness of their increase of the tariffs and the unpredictability thereof for business to be able to project themselves as an input cost. So we need to have a context into that particular situation. Thank you.
Can I add,
yes,
Minister? If we can add?
Yeah, please do, Minister.
No. I think we should broaden the discussion on the relative expensive cost of electricity. It is because around 1993, it was among the 3 lowest cost electricity in the world. It was competing with New Zealand and Canada at the bottom. And because of that price of electricity, it was a trigger for industrialization. You must remember we're coming from an era of import substitution industrialization, and electricity was used as a tool to attract industrialization. That is gone. Now, the cost of electricity is quite high. If you want to see it, look at it at minerals that are exporting raw commodities that used to process them here, whether it is manganese or chrome, because the price of electricity is much higher than electricity in Asia. Then they take raw commodities to Malaysia, to Indonesia, to China for processing. Even when there was an idea of putting export tariff on those exports. Companies calculated and discovered that the tariffs were costing less than the electricity. So the issue of electricity is quite important. Lastly, the ISMO bill. The argument that made the ISMO bill to be shelved was that you don't create a market when there is no industry. There was a monopoly. So you're creating an industry for what? And therefore we said, it can't be. That's why we say, as we take the ISMO bill back to Parliament for consideration, it should be going hand in hand with opening competition at the level of generation. Thank you.
Minister, we've from Clela, who's the CEO of the NOA Ambrose Park Oil Terminal, saying, please advise on your plans for liquid fuels like diesel and petrol that are used in 80% of transportation energy and also in industrial manufacturing energy, since our refineries are old and operating below capacity. So your plans for liquid fuels like diesel and petrol, have you got a view there?
Let me make this point in public, David. One of the most difficult things is to get the petroleum sector in a meeting. Is the most difficult thing that I have tried, because when you call them, they see themselves as competitors. I'm trying to say to them, you are an industry, you are a sector of the economy, and then when you come out of the meeting, you compete. If they can overcome that weakness, we can have a more constructive discussion with them, because it is a discussion that we must have with them. One of them, I won't tell you who, came to us and said, we want to close our refinery. And we asked them one question: what do you want to do with the refining capacity in our economy? And he gave me a long story. I said, I think let's look into the broader question, because there is a refinery plan for Richards Bay. We'll finish the pre-feasibility, we're going to build that refinery. Do existing refineries wanting to close and convert their refineries into import depots, what is the impact of that on the economy? That discussion we still want with them.
Jesse, you want to add something there?
Yeah, can I?
Jesse had a hand up. I'll come to you, Thabiso. Jesse?
Thanks. I wanted to go back to the question of Eskom, because I think this is really, really important for our sector. The scale of the Eskom challenge is enormous. I don't think we can just wish it away. This an entity that's already had 150 billion rand in bailouts. It puts the other SOEs to shame, and it needs more. It's got another 56 billion coming this year. And one of the great paradoxes here is that we don't have cost-reflective tariffs, but we also, for many years, didn't have a grip on costs. And so it felt like if you raised tariffs, it was just going to disappear into Madupi and Kusile and corruption and coal contracts that have got risen at twice the rate of inflation over the last 10 years. But I think that that's starting to change, and it seems like there's a concerted focus on tightening up in Eskom, which means two things. We're going to have to raise those tariffs. Even if we decide to subsidize industries, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but that must be a policy decision that happens outside of the entire tariff regime. You know, a lot of the kind of our competitors, places like Indonesia or Vietnam, they don't have cost reflective tariffs either. So there's huge. I mean, I think in Indonesia, it was a $4.5 billion subsidy to electricity consumers from the state last year, and growing, very similar to Eskom, in fact. But to deal with this debt balloon, we're going to have to do a whole lot of things. Tariffs are going to have to go up, and there's going to have to be a set of packages that are put in place. And those could be many things. We could use renewables and put a royalties levy on a royalties regime in place on renewable energy to try and subsidize the just transition. The minister's looking crossly at me. We can think about things like the director recently mentioned.
Vivien, I'm not cross with anybody. I'm not cross with anybody.
You shaking your hand. I thought, oh, we're going to have an argument.
No.
Director recently mentioned that Eskom's exploring a refinancing deal related to climate finance. They're going to need every single building block that they can put together to manage this transition. And I think this is a broader strategic question as well, I don't think we want Eskom to disappear. The history of Eskom is interesting. They're the people who did drive electrification, and there's still a role to play there. And what we certainly don't want to do is have private interests own our grid. It's the future of our electricity industry is very much in Eskom's role as a transmission and system operator. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Jesse, thanks for that. Any other panelists like to weigh in on this one?
Yes, Vivien.
Yes, Thabiso.
For the first time, I want to fundamentally disagree with my panel colleague, because when you talk about increasing the tariff from where it is already, and with the unemployment that we have, it does not mean those unemployment that we have in South Africa is a consequence of low skills and the low levels of numeracy and all those. We need to be cognizant, and as the minister was saying, that the cost-effective tariff is something critical. And I'm saying this to you in disagreement that there will be certain people, and in their majority, it is the poorest of the poor that won't afford those tariffs. So clearly, I think what this fact of wanting to hang up to something as old, it's like saying to old cars in South Africa, in Cuba, because of their situation, all the cars there are old. And they kept it because at the time when sanctions were imposed to them, they couldn't able to bring in car manufacturing. They instead increased their parts to be able to fix those. So this thing of South Africa hanging up to Eskom is something that we need to look at it. And I had the minister pronouncing on the second clean utility. He must move on that. We must have an alternative. This car is old. The wheel is just going to pass you on the freeway driving because showing you that the car is old. That's the first thing. The second thing that we need to take into cognizance here is when we come up with alternatives, we also need to look at the fact that if electricity becomes the biggest input cost into productivity, where does it place us as a country to compete? Because we are now in a global village. We are no more isolated. As the minister has indicated that if you beneficiate a metal that we are mining from South Africa and you put a cost of electricity that is higher, the end cost of that particular product to the world is going to be so high that you cannot able to compete. So therefore, then the issue of cost-effective electricity is one that the country must just say, let's deal with load shedding because the cost of unserved electricity is too massive and is deindustrializing our industries, which are expected to go into beneficiation or manufacturing. But in terms of that, we then need to, one of the things I want to appeal to the minister and ask, why are we excluding Eskom from being part of the IRP? Why? He's a generator. Why are you depriving Eskom not to have a wind farm? Why are you depriving Eskom not to have PVs? Why are you depriving Eskom to take advantage of the roadmap of the country?
David.
Yeah, Minister, you respond, yeah?
Tell Thabiso to go and read the IRP. Please, ask him nicely to go and read it on Eskom and renewables.
You heard the minister there, Thabiso. Please go and read the IRP. And I'm asking nicely. I do have, Jesse, go for it, and then I'm going to go back to the questions. Yeah, Jesse?
I take your point and I agree. I think having cheap electricity as an input to the economy is incredibly important. Having electricity for the economy is incredibly important. But then this takes us back to what the minister raised at the beginning around costs. And I'll admit I have an ideological predilection for state-owned enterprises, but we'll leave that aside. Part of the reason that Eskom's tariffs have risen so steeply and that there's this huge funding gap is that Medupi and Kusile cost R1.70 and R1.90 per kilowatt hour. Now we're suggesting to build nuclear at a similar sort of price, whereas renewables at current prices will be 70 cents. So if we want to talk about a least cost pathway and encouraging, economic development, then we need to really, really engage with this quite deeply. And all of the modeling, which is built, and you build up costs in a model. It's not like we're putting in an LCO, we put in capital costs and operating costs, and we characterize exactly how each technology works. And it builds a system. And in all of these system analysis by the CSIR, by Eskom, by the IRP, by UCT, wind and solar and pumped storage, batteries and gas provide the cheapest future for South Africa. That's very clear. I mean, I can't say it more persuasively than that, other than everybody has the same finding and it's consistent. And it's not about building baseload gas or new coal or large nuclear. I concede that 9.6 was going to be very expensive. We haven't assessed 2.5. But we should be very clear that if our future is on minerals and minerals beneficiation, then we need to be thinking how to make our electricity the cheapest it can be.
Jesse, thanks for that.
David, this is Vivien. Can I come in? Hello, David.
Vivien. Yes, Vivien, go.
Is it okay? Yeah, I just wanted to come in on this very important topic of cost recovery for the power utility, which is a challenge we see, all over the world. But it's clear that without, a high degree of cost recovery, it's very difficult for a utility to function effectively. It becomes reliant on state subsidies, which often are not forthcoming. These state subsidies, become a soft budget constraint that dilutes also managerial incentives. So we think it's really important to find a way to get closer to cost recovery. But I think there are two basic challenges. One is the social contract. For people to be willing to pay cost recovery prices, they have to feel that they're getting an efficient service, that management isn't wasting the resource, and that they're also getting a quality service. It's very hard to get people to be willing to pay for an unreliable service. And so usually we advise countries to get to some kind of basic degree of performance on efficiency and quality and reliability of service before going aggressively after cost recovery. The second issue is affordability, and this is obviously very pertinent in the South African context with the high rates of poverty and unemployment. Whatever tariff reforms are undertaken have to really look at what is objectively affordable for low-income households. There are various kinds of lifeline tariffs that can be put in place, or even better, there can be welfare system support that can be provided to cover electricity bills. So we encourage countries to sort of separate out the social issues, which are very, very important, and make sure that they are separately addressed. But I think the most important point is this point about keeping the costs down, particularly in view of South Africa's vocation as a minerals economy and the energy intensity of those activities, which makes the whole economy very sensitive to the price of energy. Subsidy is not the solution in the long run, but a much more efficient power system is.
Vivien, thank you for that. Tshifiwa, we haven't heard much from you. Do you want to react to anything that's been said so far?
Yes, David. I think just starting with this issue of cost reflectivity, we have to take cognizance of the fact that the grid is changing. And as we talk cost reflectivity, we have to look at unbundling the whole tariff structure. We're getting to a situation where you're going to have a lot of self-use generation, which are probably available during the day and still dependent on the utility power for peaks. So therefore, we might have to unbundle our tariff in such a way that there's clear separation between the capacity charge and the energy charge. So I thought I should just throw that in as well as part of unbundling the whole tariff structure. It's not just a matter of cost reflectivity. It's about making sure that the services are also unbundled so that we each know what we're paying for.
While you've got your
into a space where energy and capacity have to be separated and paid for separately.
Okay, thank you. While you've got your mic on, you might be able to handle this question. When will we be in a position to begin supplying municipalities formally with electricity generated on IPP sites? Can you handle that one?
I'm not too sure about the question, but if the question is about municipalities buying directly from IPPs,
it's my sense that's what the question is, yes.
That is the policy question, and I think the minister is probably in the right place to answer that. There has been a case that we are aware of in the city of Cape Town involving the department. So that I'll leave for the minister to respond to.
Okay, Minister, do you want to pick up that one? A question from one of our audience members, Emil. Have you got it, Minister? There you are.
David? Yes. No, I don't know if people have read the regulations for that. We've published them for comment. That we're opening up that municipality can buy their own electricity. They can self-generate. They can partner with whomsoever. The only complication that we're going to have there is that if they buy from me as a renewable company and I sell them my electricity and it is coming with a town, that is actually a transaction in its own. And therefore, I will have to get a license and trade with that town. If the town is building its own electricity, that is self-generation, it can go ahead. That is already open. So you don't need to ask after a regulator out there for comments. People must comment on the regulation. Now, David, can I just appeal to the panelists? You see, this thing just says cost reflectivity, and it says renewable are cheaper. You know, that is actually interesting in the sense that some of the people who always argue for one technology always talk of cheaper as an anticipated reality than current reality. That in future, renewable will be cheaper and so forth. I think we should desist from that. There is no technology that will survive on the corpses of other technologies. Every technology is open out there to grow. Renewables have been given the biggest bulk of growth. They must use that and grow and contest other technologies. They must not pray for their death.
Let's go back to the questions. Ntumba has asked this question: if gas is to replace coal as base load supply, contemplating variable renewable energy in the near future, how far are we in establishing the enabling physical gas infrastructure, pipelines, etc., given that Eskom is under pressure to decommission coal soon? Any of the panelists like to field that one?
Okay, will I come again?
You want? Why not, Minister? Go for it.
Can I? Oh, okay.
Let's go, Minister, then we'll go to you, Thabiso.
Let Thabiso go first.
Okay, Thabiso, go for it.
Yeah. Look, I think given that it is now clear that the Saldanha, Kucha, and Richards Bay are identified as areas where gas infrastructure is going to be, what's then going to follow is the aggregator and the country saying how much gas are we going to require, because before you can do your estimate on your pipeline, what informs that is the number of molecules you require to pump those power stations, which then informs you. If you do it the other way around, then you are going to have a suboptimal infrastructure in the country. The type of, what we know for the fact is the Remco pipeline gives servitude that we can duplicate that. and put another pipe. What we know is there's a multi-product pipeline for Transnet that lands in Heidelberg, for instance. We can use that servitude. What we know is there's a Lily pipeline that then has a T-junction in Secunda. We can use that. And Kucha can therefore then supply the coastal areas. And you can even regard that Kucha, then the distance is closer to Mossel Bay and start doing the pipeline. But if you are not starting by saying the refinery then that is in Mossel Bay is going to be used to be in full capacity, and these are the molecules we require, then to do the cost pricing for that and the pipeline network, and becomes something that is very difficult. But I think government has moved by identifying those areas, and therefore then the question is how much gas are we bringing, and therefore then how much of the infrastructure do we require from piping to bringing that in order to reach. Like if Kucha was to be done first, it will be too far for Gauteng. But if you're building it in such a way that you're saying Kucha will serve the coastline, and therefore then Richards Bay will serve Natal, but also it's nearer, it's about 500, 600 kilometers to Gauteng. Therefore, then you can avert certain things, and then we can able to put the infrastructure. But if you haven't decided exactly even how much does an anchored line like Eskom going to require from a gas perspective, then it becomes difficult, because I will build it in accordance of I need a gas to power station that only serves me and I'm able to pay and get the returns, while the country needs more. Because if you talk infrastructure, it's like a freeway. You don't build a freeway for the current traffic. You build a freeway on the basis of what you project 50 years from now. That is why we still have our freeways able to accommodate some traffic, but is now beginning to be smaller because the traffic is increasing. So infrastructure by nature is not calculated on the present value. You calculate it projected. That is why if you're looking at infrastructure, you need to begin to say, what type of South Africa do we want to see from an economic perspective? Because your demand line is informed by population growth and economic growth. But you can't look at it now when we are in recession and we are growing below, it's a negative growth. So if you are to provide an infrastructure projecting the current situation as we see it, we can't able to build any pipeline. But if we are projecting that post-COVID and going forward to 2050, this is what we project as the country. Therefore, then we will be able to then invest as policy is also clearer, because policy direction in this particular regard is very key in driving the investment.
Thanks, Thabiso. Minister, do you want to add anything there, or shall I move on to the next question?
I think the debate should not be gas replacing coal. We must debate gas as a commodity that will be contributing to energy security. Because coal is not lying in a bed waiting for its date of funeral. You know, it is doing many things. They are looking at cleaner coal technologies, like your high efficiency, low emission. They look into coal-based method. They look into carbon capture and use. They're looking at something because they're a sector. They want to use their commodity for the longest period. So gas in itself must be developed. Thabiso, we're not saying it will be in Richards Bay, then Kucha. If we get developers who want to invest in Kucha, we'll allow them first. Because one of the things that we should also do is to restructure the economy. This is an opportunity. And try to diversify our economy from the tripartite points, which is Durban, Witwatersrand, and Cape Town. We must try to develop the economy. If we can have an LNG in Kucha and develop a gas industry there and grow from there, let's do that, because It is a crisis that we're facing, and the president is always telling all of us not to waste the crisis. We must be innovative enough during this crisis and not wait for post-COVID. We do things now, prepare things now, we contribute now. Thank you.
Let's a very interesting question here from Mei Zheng, if I pronounce that correctly, from the China Africa Development Fund. He says, for the development of own generation, the financing of projects is a problem. Without Eskom PPA and sovereign guarantee, it's difficult to get banks financing. What are the possible ways to solve this problem? Who from the panel can take that question?
Can I respond to that, David?
Yep, Thabiso.
David, because we needed this sector of renewable, this is not just something that was done unplanned. This was the resolution of 2007 in Polokwane, and it also became a resolution in the 2012 on climate change. But I want to challenge anyone to be saying that if you go and build a 50 megawatt plant in Zambia now, you will not get a sovereign guarantee. The government of South Africa did that because it wanted to encourage a new sector to come in. You can go to Australia and want to build a plant there. You won't get a sovereign guarantee. So sometimes I think you find this complication of funding. 2011, I was one of the first IPPs on a project of about 1.2 billion. If you do 80-20 split on debt and equity, then you go to a DFI that says to you, put 10%. Where will I find the 10% while this thing is a project finance with a treasury guarantee behind? So some of these complexities, we just need to sit as a country and begin to say, if a project is bankable, in the private sector, if a project is bankable and it's a project finance, it does not go to an issue of sovereign support. But by the way, just when we talk electricity, the commercial banks and the DFIs are beginning to want to cover double the way at which this thing is being covered. We need to look at that, Minister, because if we are to continue, that is why we're able to spend 200 billion. Let's take a view. I heard Tshifiwa presenting that this round 1 up to 4 has produced so much black-owned whatever. There's no such. There's just no such. And therefore, then I don't think that's a debate for today, but we need to look at it and put, and all my other colleagues can be there. I would want to have Jazz there. I would want to have Tshifiwa. I would probably wish to have the minister or the minister's advisors or whoever that is in charge, and the DFIs in the same room, that we debate this particular principle. Because clearly, project finance is project finance. It has its own protocols to it, and we need to begin to support it if we are really intending to roll out and address the gap that exists in South Africa. Financing shouldn't be a problem.
Vivien, have you got something to add on this issue of the difficulty in getting banks financing?
I think the question is misplaced, David. In the majority of cases that we're dealing with, self-generation is called self-generation. I am running a gold mine. I want to develop a PV net next to my mine. Half the time I don't need funding, I fund it myself because it's self-generation. That's why in the 130 registered 1 megawatt and below cases, it has gone, it's 130 now, it will grow. And the 5 that are in more than 1 megawatt and growing, it is there because it is not about funding. It doesn't need sovereign guarantee. People want to self-generate to cushion themselves to unpredictability of the Eskom electricity supply.
We've got 2 minutes left here. Vivien, did you want to add anything there?
I'm not very familiar with the specifics. I mean, in general, we see that, you know, off-taker risk is an important consideration when companies are investing in generation by themselves. And in less mature markets, it is typical to have some form of guarantees. But as other commentators have mentioned, as markets mature, as there's more clarity over pricing and demand, then gradually those kinds of supports can be lifted. But maybe since we're finishing up, David, and I'll just maybe leave you with 2 or 3 messages. I mean, I think first of all, I see the need for really South Africa to focus on getting onto a least cost energy path, both for generation, but also in terms of the way the utility is operated. Neither the economy nor South Africa's citizens can afford inflated energy costs. So I think tackling that is paramount. Secondly, looking from the outside, I see so many strengths, potential strengths in South Africa. I see a country endowed with excellent natural energy resources, both on its domestic soil and its immediate neighborhood. I see a country with a world-class IPP program and a strong domestic capital market. It should be possible to put all those things together to realize that vision of a least cost energy development. And finally, I would just remind everyone, don't overlook the demand side. It's always tempting to see everything in terms of building new infrastructure, but energy efficiency and demand side interventions also need to be part of your strategy.
Vivien, thank you very much. Vivien Foster, Chief Economist for Infrastructure at the World Bank. Thank you for your time. Minister, some final parting shot from you?
No, I appreciated the discussion. I think we can have more of this, not only wait for the summit. The one point that I always want to caution South Africans about is to allow ourselves to be encircled and bring policy options from developed economies to a developing economy and believe that they will work. They will not work here because we are a developing economy. Sometimes we become arrogant and pretend as if we're a developed economy. Let's try to grow our own wood. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time, Minister. The Minister of Mineral and Energy Resources, Minister Gwede Mantashe. Jesse Burton from UCT, formerly of Rhodes, sharing an alma mater with me. Thoughts from you, Jesse? Oh, you're on mute. You need to unmute, Jesse.
Sorry. I just want to say thank you so much to my fellow panelists. This was a wonderfully engaging discussion, and I hope that we can have more. I think that there's much to be done, and in the earlier session, in the presidential roundtable, I was listening to a lot of the banks, the AFDB, the NDB, the World Bank, the DBSA, all talking how this is South Africa has the best program on the continent for renewables. We need to be environmentally sustainable. What can we do to kind of crowd in private sector investment? And I think we've touched on a lot of those issues today. And I hope that we can actually continue this engagement going forward and think about how to unblock what's holding us.
Thank you, Jesse. And I did find your Twitter feed quite illuminating as well. So I'm going to tell people, follow you on Twitter. Am I right? It's at Jesse_Burton. Is that right?
Yes, thank you.
I didn't ask the minister for his Twitter handle or Instagram account because I didn't think he had one. Thanks for your time, Jesse. Thabiso Tenyane, Executive Chair and CEO of Phakwe Group. Let's have a couple of thoughts from you there, Thabiso.
Let me express my gratitude for being invited to this panel, and thanks to my fellow panelists for a robust discussion. Colleagues, we have one country and we have no alternative country to go. We need to urgently fix South Africa and get the wheels of the economy to start turning again. That will require a reliable supply of energy. I hope this is not a once-off event. I plead with the organizers to develop an action plan that we can see being executed. For an economy to employ capital and labor, it needs some energy. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Thabiso, and I appreciate you poking the bear as you did in that discussion. And Tshifiwa, Magoro, I'm feeling bad that I didn't bring you in more often on this, but there were some motor mouths to contend with. Some final thoughts from you.
It's all right, David. I'm hoping we'll have more engagement as well about this, because this is very important for the country. Yes, maybe just to emphasize that as the IPP office, we stand ready to support the government and the department in rolling out the procurement program. So I'm hoping that we're going to have more engagement of this nature via the SIDS to give more details of the upcoming programs. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Just maybe to emphasize again with regard to investment, whenever we talk investment, we always focus on the generation side, and forgetting that there is a lot of need for investment in the distribution side of the electricity supply industry. So that is one area that is always neglected. So let's not forget that in future discussions. This is the message to the organizers.
Tshifiwa, thank you very much to Tshifiwa Magoro, the head of the Independent Power Producers Office. I do apologize also to all the people who sent in questions that we weren't able to get through. I think we got through a significant number of them, but that is our time up. And if Ditsego Tsebe, who's been fabulous from the presidency organizing this, I know she's listening to this, it may seem that this is the first conversation of many. I'm David O'Sullivan. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation, and bye-bye.